Thank you so much for that, Beth. That's just energizing. We come to the scripture reading for today, and we read out of the book of Nehemiah in the Old Testament. If you have trouble finding it, go to Psalms and back up a little bit. This is an important story that comes out of Israel's history in chapter 4. When Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he became angry and was greatly incensed. He ridiculed the Jews in the presence of his associates in the army of Samaria. He said, "What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish it in a day? Can they bring the stones back to life from those heaps of rubble, burned as they are?" Tobiah the Ammonite, who was at his side, said, "What they are building, even a fox climbing up on it would break down their walls of stones." Hear us, our God, for we are despised. Turn their insults back on their own heads. Give them over as plunder in a land of captivity. Do not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight, for they have thrown insults in the face of the builders. So we rebuilt the wall till all of it reached half its height, for the people worked with all their heart. But when Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the people of Ashdod heard that the repairs to Jerusalem's walls had gone ahead and that the gaps were being closed, they were very angry. They all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and stir up trouble against it. But we prayed to our God and posted a guard day and night to meet this threat. Meanwhile, the people in Judah said, "The strength of the laborers is giving out, and there's so much rubble, we cannot rebuild the wall." Our enemies said, "Before they know it or see us, we'll be right there among them, and we'll kill them and put an end to their work." Then the Jews who lived near them came and told us 10 times over, "Wherever you turn, they will attack us." Therefore I stationed some of the people behind the lowest points of the wall at the exposed places, posting them by families with their swords, spears, and bows. After I looked things over, I stood up and said to the nobles and the officials and the rest of the people, "Don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who's great and awesome. Fight for your families, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes." And when our enemies heard that we were aware of their plot and that God had frustrated it, we all returned to the wall, each to our own work. From that day on, half of my men were equipped with work while half of men did the work while the other half were equipped with spears, shields, bows, and armor. The officers posted themselves behind all the people of Judah who were building the wall. Those who carried the materials did their work with one hand and held a weapon in the other. And each of the builders wore his sword at his side as he worked. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. You gotta love a combat story, don't you? I love watching the Astros. I hate it when they play on the West Coast because it keeps me up way too late, but I love watching them. And I love watching them come back from a deficit like they did last night. I love improbable victories, such as when SMU actually wins a football game. It happens every once in a while. And in a quite literal way, that's what this account of Nehemiah is all about. It is the tale about how a handful of Jews who had survived the exile to Babylon were miraculously able decades later to defy all odds and come back and return to their homeland, where they not only managed to rebuild the city, which had stood in ruins for most of that time, but they also began all over again this business of being God's people. This is a story such that I think has more than just passing relevance for you and for me this morning. We've engaged in our little campaign on building for the future, but I suspect we could find a few better examples in the Bible that would be more inspiring to us than this story of how Nehemiah and the exiles came home. See, this story, the story of how God's people in that time found that God was able, somehow has something to do with our story. The story of how God would like to work in your life and in mine, and in particular maybe in the life of our church. Right off the bat, for instance, you can easily draw the lesson that if what happened with Nehemiah teaches us anything, it ought to remind us that there is never any mission or task so great or so hard that God cannot do it if we let him. There's never any project so difficult, so complicated, in such bad shape that God can't pull it out and turn it around and then restore it to new and better shape than ever. You see, by human standards, the task that faced Nehemiah and his crew was practically and reasonably impossible. Now, just to refresh your knowledge of ancient history, in 587 BC, the Babylonians pretty much destroyed Jerusalem. They tore down its walls. They looted its temple. They burned its buildings and all its homes. And then they carted off most of the population and resettled them 500 miles to the east in Babylon. There they remained for 70 years until the first trickle of exiles began to return. It took another 50 years before Ezra led a second and much larger wave back in 458 BC. He took the less safe blue route rather than the longer, more easily traversed red one. And then it was another 13 years until Nehemiah, who had been a court official for the Persians, he was the cupbearer for the king. He tasted his wine to make sure it wasn't poisoned. A very trusted official. The Persians had to replace the Babylonians. And Nehemiah was able to bring a third group back in 445 BC or so. But what Nehemiah found when he returned to Jerusalem, the golden, was that though the temple had been rebuilt, sort of, everything else was still pretty much a disaster. The holy city of David and of David's God Yahweh, Zion the Fair, the place where for centuries Jews had believed God himself somehow favored and looked upon with a particular kindness, was not just a city which had seen its better days and needed some touch-up, urban renewal here and there. It was quite literally a pile of rubble. A city without walls where animals roamed freely, enemies easily entered. A town which lay in ruins, shattered as dramatically as the lives of those who had once lived there. And if all that weren't bad enough, what they found was that the people that had moved into the area in their place were hostile to them. This was an impossible task. This was a ridiculous idea. Don't even think about trying to rebuild Jerusalem. Far better, far easier, far cheaper to simply start over again someplace new. In New Jerusalem, Zion Meadows, Jerusalem Place, whatever you want to call it. Go a little further, start over. Except for one thing. Nehemiah knew God wasn't finished with Jerusalem yet. God had not given up on it. And so after quietly inspecting it by himself, going at night, examining its walls which had been broken down and its gates which had been burned, he urged his people on with a simple word of encouragement. He rallied them with the cry, "Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem. We will no longer be in disgrace. Come, let us rise up and build." You know, he was right, because I'm convinced of this more than anything else this morning. God indeed does not give up on things. Not on cities, not on countries, not on churches, not on the world, not on people, not on you and me. Even we may have given up on ourselves. think in this respect of a missionary with whom I worked long ago in France. Bill Capitanute was a Nehemiah kind of fellow. He never gave up on anything or anybody. You can know that because he had 12 sons waiting for that daughter, which came along, number 13. Bill saw the potential in every individual, and even in every building, everything he ran across. Everything we had in our missionary compound, in fact, had been redeemed from some sordid or at least questionable past. Our missionary home in Billy-Montagny, this little village where I lived in the north of France, half Polish, half French, was perfect as a missionary housing because it had lots of little rooms. It had been a house of prostitution. The church had been the town dance hall and honky-tonk. Our mobile chapel had been a wine truck. We built our outreach youth center on what had been the town dump. We bought our playground equipment from the communists. And one day, Bill brought home a trailer, a flatbed trailer that he said that we could use for preaching outdoors places. But the only trouble was it was all rust. Nothing held it together except the rust. And I remember Bill saying in his thick Ukrainian accent, one by one, building by building, dump by dump, we're going to win this village over to Jesus. And it worked. It worked simply because God never gives up on things. God never gives up on people so long as you and I are willing to be his hands of restoration and labor. What did we just sing? You make beautiful things. You make them out of the dust. That's what a church ought to be about too. We ought to be a rescue station perched right by the entrance to hell, encouraging and believing in people, not giving up on them, pushing ahead to redeem them. And when we do so, we will discover, however, what Nehemiah and his friends also found out, which is that whenever a good thing is afoot, opposition will soon follow after it. To put it in show business terms, when you step out front, everybody's a critic. You read this account here in chapter 4. What soon becomes obvious, the biggest obstacle that the Jews faced in rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem was not the actual work itself, as hard as that was. It was fending off their opponents who not only insulted them and made fun of them, but who actually began to fight them and snipe at their heels as they tried to work. When those opponents, in particular, a guy named Sanballat, who was the governor of Samaria, the province just north of Judah, north of Jerusalem, and his friend Tobiah, an aristocratic Jew who lived beyond the Jordan River, on the other side of the river, where he was governor of Ammon, along with the Arabs and the ancient adversaries of Israel, the Philistines who lived in Ashdod on the Mediterranean coast. It's in the Gaza Strip now. When they heard that the wall was being rebuilt, they not only became angry about it, they decided they had to stop it. What does this bunch of feeble Jews think they are doing, they asked. The stone walls would collapse if even a fox walked across the top of them. And when that wasn't enough, they upped the ante and turned to sabotage and to violence. Does it seem to anybody else that the society of Sanballat is still around today, even in some churches? See, I have a feeling we've all experienced some sniping in our lives, even if it didn't involve actual arrows or bullets. Whenever we start to do something for God, somebody's going to come along who wants to tear it all down. We get saved, for instance, and before long, someone, maybe somebody close to us in our family, tells us that we really shouldn't go overboard on this religious stuff. People will think we're fanatics, as though that's a worse label than being a drunkard or a hellraiser. Or we get excited about doing something in our faith, we make a decision, then we're going to stand up for Jesus. Maybe we even feel called into full-time ministry of some sort. And bam, somebody will almost always come along to try to shoot us out of the skies. We even decide to just do something in the church, to move ahead in a new ministry maybe, start a new program, for instance. Maybe we just want to make Jesus known more to other people. You can almost set your watch by it, my friends. As soon as we step out to do anything good for God, somebody else will step in. And the criticism and the opposition will start. So what did Nehemiah do in the face of such scorn? He went right on with the work anyway. And when the naysayers turned from simply trying to stir up confusion to actually carrying out sniper attacks on the workers, then Nehemiah simply assigned half of the folks to work and the other half to stand guard while they did so, some to work, some to watch. He stationed them, some of the workers, at the exposed places, setting a watch, the language tells us, with swords, carbotum, that's related to the word cherub, by the way. Think about that the next time you try to minimize cutesy little cherub angels. And spears, romach, it's the only place that word appears in the Old Testament, and bows and arrows. So again, half the folks did the work, the other half protected them. Some folks even held a trowel in one hand and a sword in the other, while a guy with a trumpet walked up and along the line, up and down the wall line, ready to call for help whenever it was needed. They did all this because Nehemiah knew that opposition doesn't always mean you're wrong and that you ought to stop. Sometimes it means exactly the opposite. You are right. You need to forge ahead. It's like St. Paul once told the folks in Corinth, fire will test the quality of each man's work. And in some ways, until we've been in the fire, neither our lives nor our faith has been tested. It hasn't yet been strengthened and made pure. Some of you may be in the fire this morning, but take heart. The hymn writer once put it, the flame shall not hurt thee. I only design thy dross to consume and thy gold to refine. The story of Nehemiah reminds us that good things usually produce opposition, not just to the projects themselves, but to the people as well. Matthew Henry once summed it up this way. He said, many a good work has been looked upon with contempt by proud and haughty scorners. Those who disagree in almost everything else will unite in persecution. But Nehemiah did not answer those fools according to their folly. He looked up to God in prayer. And then he goes on to say, the hindering good work is what bad men aim at and promise themselves success in. But good work is God's work, and it shall prosper. This is just amazing tale, reminds us in the end. The city was rebuilt. The walls were joined together. So verse 6 reads, because the people had a mind to work. That is, they worked with all their hearts, with all of their will, all their intellect, all their feelings. That's what the word lev means in Hebrew. They took what was at the very center of their lives, thus they worked to accomplish and to advance a goal that was bigger than themselves. They did it because, in the simplest of terms, they understood that it was important and that it meant something. They did it, we should note, because as verse 15 tells us, every person had a place in that work, and they each went to it. Some guards, some builders. Some shoved wheelbarrows, some laid bricks, some mixed mortars, some drew plans, some carried water around to the workers. Undoubtedly, some of them fixed lunch every day. But everyone had their own work. They did it not just until they got tired or tired of their task. They did it until it was done, completing that work, so Nehemiah 6 tells us, in just 52 days. I have a feeling that our walls are not finished sometimes even to half the height God might want them to be. Unlike those people of Nehemiah's day, we don't always have a mind or a heart to work, do we? We'd like it done for us. We want the church staff or the Methodist hierarchy, people who we pay, Encore, somebody else, anybody else, to do what God has called us to be doing, to feed the hungry and to care for the poor, to work for justice and to practice peace, to heal the sick and encourage the lonely, to introduce the world to Christ and Christ to the world that desperately needs to know him. See, I have a really personal question to ask you this morning. I want you to think hard about it. If you and I had been there with Nehemiah, if the rebuilding of Jerusalem had depended upon our efforts and our contributions and our pledges and upon our willingness to get involved in the actual work somewhere, upon our level of commitment and service, would those walls ever have been rebuilt? Would the rebuilding, in fact, ever have even started? A number of years back, a man named Vince Havner wrote a little piece entitled, "When the Circus Did Not Hinder." This is what he said. It will be a bad week for our revival. We have the fair, the concert, the circus, football this week. The sons and daughters of one lodge have a supper. The high school has a dance. And on it goes, while defeated church members build up their alibis. But any church that has to take a back seat and fearfully anticipate every sideshow that blows into town is already defeated. We have developed an inferiority complex before the world, the flesh, and the devil. We apologetically take what is left in attendance. The early church, however, did not quake every time the ungodly had a spree in Jerusalem. The saints in Rome did not have the blues because attendance would be cut by a gladiatorial contest at the Colosseum. They had a robust, world-shaking power of their own that eventually put the Colosseum out of business. And if we recovered that, we would leave our little hot chocolate huddles in church basements and give the world today a demonstration that would make its little efforts look like firecrackers beside atom bombs. See, God really does have a word for us in this amazing comeback story of Nehemiah and the exiles. So I ask you, as we come to a time of commitment in our congregation next week, this simple question: why don't we likewise rise up and do something truly good for God here? Building a church that dares to include every person in this community who's felt excluded at other places or just plain left out in life. That's what's at the root of our Building for the Future campaign. There's some little brochures out on the table if you want one that'll give you all the plans and show you the drawings and the cost and all the specifications of it. But let me just make the bottom line for you. This is to become a church that purposes to do more for others than we do for ourselves. A church that sees its responsibility in bringing the whole world to know Jesus Christ. A church that understands that as beautiful as this room is, and it is the most beautiful room in Sugar Land, there are people who will never come in it. But they might come over to the gym next door after we've renovated that and made it into a suitable place for worship. A church that is a place of healing and restoration for all who come here, a true sanctuary for all who have been chased down and run over by life, and all who desperately need a place and a time to recharge, to be still and know that he is God. Now, we're not asking for a lot. Let me be clear. Our operating budget of about $3 million is not inappropriate for a church of 4,100 members. We're behind on it. Our building program, $600,000 or $700,000 for the work in the sanctuary and in the Family Life Center, is not an overly ambitious one. If every active family determined to give just an extra $100 a month for the next 15 months, we'd just about have it. But to do any of this, we need everybody to come find their place along the wall. Come find your place along the wall. Some of you will be right there in about 3 weeks when we take the Israel study trip. But all of us need to be right there, right here somehow. And if you have been in the society of Sanballat, if you've played the critic, may I invite you to give that up today? And instead ask God to use you in his work. Nehemiah told his workers not to be afraid of the enemy, but to remember the Lord, who is great and glorious. So in the words of another cherished old hymn of the church, rise up, ye saints of God. The church for you doth wait. Her strength unequal to her task. Rise up and make her great. For when our enemies heard, we were aware of their plot and that God had frustrated it. We all returned to the wall, each to his own work. May it be so for you and me this morning. Amen.
As we prepare to come to the table, we are